By the time he turned 45, Simon Clark had already achieved everything a man of his age could dream of. He had a beautiful big house, an expensive car, and a job as the head of a bank. Unfortunately, being the embodiment of success and prosperity to everyone around him, Simon wasn't actually happy, and thought back to the times when he was young with sadness in his heart. It was rumored that many years ago, the director of the bank had a personal drama, any mention of which would still cause him heartache. Sure, Simon Clark had many relationships in his life, some more fleeting than others, but they never ended in something serious. Despite his age, the man was still single and shared his loneliness with his terrier dog, Teddy. Simon found him as a blind puppy 3 years ago. The poor thing was sitting by the garbage can. He was hungry and thirsty and moving his nose from side to side in search for something edible. It was then that he was noticed by Simon, who had always loved animals. Having taken in the unfortunate puppy, the man immediately surrounded him with care and attention, and the animal quickly got better. Since then, Teddy had become the meaning of Simon's life, and he was rather tired of being alone. Few of the banker's acquaintances knew that he was in love only once in his life. April Brown was Simon's fiancée, and in his mind, there could never be anyone as beautiful as she was. Unfortunately, their relationship ended as suddenly as it began. The fact was that 20 years ago, Simon got into a terrible car accident, after which he fell into a coma for 6 months. However, when the man finally woke up, he learned that something very unfortunate happened while he was out. According to Simon's parents, April left him and moved to some unknown place. The poor man couldn't believe that April could be so cruel. How could she do it? She could leave me when I was fighting for my life in the ICU? The man thought with tears in his eyes. Simon had to go through a lot before the pain of April's departure dulled and stopped being all he could think about. Nevertheless, the man still couldn't find the answer to his question. Why did April leave? On the other hand, Simon was well aware that life didn't stand still, and it was simply impossible to continue living in his memories. Trying to distract himself from sad thoughts and to stop pining over April, the man focused on work, and in 20 years, he achieved amazing success. Simon had to go a long way from the position of a courier delivering written orders to the head of the bank, which achieved an unprecedented level of success under his leadership. And now, sitting in his office, the banker was looking through the reports from the past month, making notes in his notebook. Suddenly, Simon's gaze fell on his desk clock, which, among other things, showed the date. God, how could I forget? It's April's birthday today, the banker thought. The thing was that for 20 years now, Simon had his own tradition, which only he could understand. Once a year, on the day of April's birthday, he bought a bouquet of white roses, which were his girlfriend's favorite. He still kept a picture of April in his pocket, where she was captured holding a bouquet just like that. Glancing at his watch, the banker whistled in surprise and loudly announced to his subordinates that the lunch break had begun. Actually, the lunch break wasn't supposed to start for another 20 minutes. But Simon was never one to stick to a strict schedule, and therefore, he often made concessions for his subordinates, which helped him quickly earn their love and respect. Already at the exit, the banker ran into the young cleaning lady, Ashley Parker, who, just like him, was hurrying off somewhere. Seeing Simon Clark, the woman hesitated for a moment and lowered her eyes. The banker smiled and politely let the woman go first. The fact was that the man always sympathized with this young cleaning lady, who immediately became an outcast at the office thanks to the unkind treatment by the other employees. This was partly due to Ashley's innate modesty, and partly due to her cheap clothes that were clearly bought on sale, and the eternal lack of money. Feeling sympathetic, Simon Clark often helped the young cleaning lady and even gave her regular bonuses, which were sometimes as much as half of her salary. The man understood that it must have been very difficult for the woman who grew up in a poor family to live in the modern world built on money and power. And now, looking at Ashley leave, Simon thought wistfully, she's probably in a hurry to get home for a bite to eat. She just doesn't have the money to dine at the cafe on the corner. The banker was pulled out of his sad thoughts by his vibrating phone. Seeing the caller ID, Simon turned pale and his forehead got instantly covered with sweat. With a trembling hand, the banker pressed the answer button and immediately heard the insinuating voice of the private detective whom he hired a month ago to search for April. "Mr. Clark? Sir, I have some news for you. I think I found April Brown. Let's meet at the cafe on the corner in half an hour and discuss everything," the detective suggested calmly and judiciously. Having a hard time getting a hold of himself, Simon agreed to the meeting. Half an hour was just enough time for him to buy the bouquet of roses and get back to meet the detective. To Simon's great surprise, he ran into the cleaning woman Ashley at the flower shop. She was there to buy a bouquet of white roses too. Since the woman was talking to the vendor at the time and didn't see the person that entered the shop, the banker stepped aside and began to patiently wait for his turn. Meanwhile, an entire drama played out before his eyes. "Stop fooling me, lady. If you don't have the money to buy this bouquet, then we have nothing more to talk about," the seller said louder than she needed to. "But it's only $100, ma'am. I work at a bank around the corner. I'm sure you've noticed it. I'll get my paycheck tomorrow and pay you back with interest," Ashley pleaded. But the saleswoman wasn't going to help Ashley out, as she immediately identified her as poor. "That's a rather elaborate lie you came up with, working at a bank. Do you think I'd believe that? Go look for some other fool to fall for your lies. We're not running a charity here. We don't hand out bouquets worth hundreds of dollars to random people off the street. And if you don't stop getting on my nerves right now, I'll call the guard and he'll quickly get you out of here," the saleswoman said, reveling in power. Ashley's eyes instantly filled with tears, which burned her cheeks flushed with shame. The situation escalated to the limit, and if not for the intervention of Simon Clark, the vendor really would have kicked the young cleaning lady out. "No need to call security, ma'am. This woman really works at the bank, and I'm her supervisor. I will pay for a bouquet, but you should be more considerate with your customers." Simon Clark broke the silence. Simon's interjection had a very strong effect on Ashley and the quarrelsome saleswoman. "No need, sir. I couldn't let you do that. You've always been so kind to me. This is just too much," Ashley tried to object. But Simon Clark had already pulled out a $100 bill out of his wallet and handed it to the astonished saleswoman. Then he bought the exact same bouquet for himself, and having left a generous tip, left the store. The point was that Simon was in a hurry to meet the private detective who managed to get on April's trail. When the banker stepped inside the cafe, Henry Rogers was already there, sipping cold lemonade. "Well, please don't keep me waiting. What did you manage to find out?" Simon asked instead of a greeting. The private detective turned somewhat gloomy in response and pulled out a small folder from his briefcase. Looking at the banker, burning with impatience, Henry began his story. As it turned out, April didn't move anywhere 20 years ago, but continued to live in New York. However, what the private detective said next made Simon gasp and his heart start racing. The fact was that his ex-fiancée died 7 years ago from bilateral pneumonia. Moreover, April Brown was survived by a daughter whom she had 20 years ago. Dear Lord, how is that possible? That's right about the time we broke up. What if she's my daughter too? Simon thought, shuddering at his own suspicion. Unfortunately, Henry Rogers failed to find April Brown's daughter, which he immediately informed the banker about. Can't there be a mistake? Is she really dead? Simon asked, stammering at every word. But seeing the look in the detective's eyes, the banker realized that there was no mistake. "Do you know where she's buried? I'd like to visit her grave," Simon asked in a trembling voice. Henry Rogers meekly nodded in response and took a pen out of his pocket to jot down the location of April's grave in the city cemetery. With a trembling hand, Simon Clark wrote the detective a check for twice the agreed amount. "It's a bonus," the banker explained, having noticed the surprised look on the detective's face. At that moment, Simon could easily write a check for $1 million, if only it could bring April back. The banker got into his car and slowly headed for the city cemetery. Simon's heart was breaking with pain and anguish caused by the death of the woman he loved all his life. He quickly found the location of April's grave. But when the banker came closer, he saw a stranger with a bouquet of white roses there. Taking a closer look, Simon shuddered and felt dizzy as he recognized the young woman. Unable to contain his emotions, he almost shouted, "Ashley, what are you doing here?" The young cleaning lady looked at him with eyes full of tears and softly replied, "I came to visit my mother. It's her birthday today, and she loved white roses." There are no words to describe the effect this revelation had on the banker. For a moment, Simon felt like he was in a world of crooked mirrors, where his every action set off a chain of shocking events. Having stepped closer to Ashley, Simon took a picture of April out of his pocket and handed it to her. "I loved your mother very much, dear," the banker whispered with tears in his eyes. Ashley carefully took the photo and pressed it to her heart, unable to contain her emotions. Then she hugged Simon Clark, who was probably her father. As it turned out later, April didn't betray her fiancé who fell into a coma. Simon's parents disliked her from day one, and when Simon was in a coma, they did everything they could to drive her away. It was them who insisted that April leave Simon Clark's life forever. Unfortunately, Simon's parents didn't know that when they forced their breakup, April was already in her 5th week of pregnancy. Offended by Simon's parents, April decided to raise the baby alone. During all this time, she never tried to contact Simon or ask for his help. It's hard to even imagine what the unfortunate woman had to go through, and with a little baby in her care. Ashley couldn't hold back her tears as she told Simon about all the hardships her mother had to face. She remembered perfectly well the times when her mother came home from work exhausted, but still found the strength to cook dinner for her. Unfortunately, excessive workloads, poor nutrition, and constant stress played a bad joke on April Brown, cutting her life very short. Having listened to his daughter's confession, Simon Clark hugged her and whispered, "I will never leave you again, dear." Ashley only smiled sweetly and kissed her father on the cheek in response. The father and daughter left the cemetery holding hands, as if afraid to lose each other again. An old cemetery caretaker watched them leave and went back to his lodge, hiding a smile at the corner of his mouth. Ashley and Simon headed off into their new life, which will have no place for lies and unjustified expectations that have haunted them all these long years.